Most groups of friends won't kick a guy when he's down. For example, when your buddy loses his job, the last thing you do is make fun of him. Well, someone forgot to tell that to Japan in the early 20th century. Indeed, rather than pick up its neighbor, China, and dust off his shoulders for him, Japan exploited the weakness and internal strife of China to aggressively invade Chinese territory. Prior to the mid-19th century, Japan had been closed to any foreign travelers or traders. This xenophobic policy that had been in place since the early 17th century was extreme. Stories emerged of shipwrecked sailors from Western Europe being killed just for washing up on the island nation's shores. However, this changed in the 1850s when an American fleet led by Commodore Matthew Perry forced the Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan, to sign treaties that opened its ports to foreign trade. The ensuing flood of foreign cash into the Japanese market exacerbated pre-existing economic problems, and the Tokugawa government fell shortly after. It was replaced by the first Meiji Emperor, and the powerful nobles who surrounded him intended to modernize and industrialize Japan as quickly as possible. In relatively short order, railroads crisscrossed the island nation, and Japan's shipping industry, virtually non-existent due to the laws against foreign trade, rose dramatically. As quickly as Japan industrialized, the country began looking to expand its foreign influence. In 1894, Japan fought a 2-year conflict with China, which freed the Korean peninsula from Chinese control and opened Chinese ports to Japanese trade. 10 years later, Japan went to war again, this time against the encroaching Russian presence in Manchuria. Victorious again, Japan gained protectorate status over the Korean peninsula and forced Russia out of Chinese land. By the time World War I broke out in 1914, Japan was looking to extend its influence into China proper, while Europe was occupied elsewhere. In 1915, they presented China with the 21 demands. Though not all of the demands were recognized, Japan gained protectorate status and effective rule over large areas of northern China, including Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, as well as economic interests in Chinese state-owned mining operations. As part of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Japan further gained the rights to Germany's sphere of influence in China's Shandong province. As one might guess, by the developments just discussed, as Japan's star rose in the international sky, the power and clout of the Chinese state was falling in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The 19th century saw China's long period of stability under the Ming Dynasty interrupted by the arrival of Western powers. Through several conflicts that the Chinese were ill-prepared to fight, Western powers carved out of China economic spheres of influence, regions that were still under nominal Chinese control, but whose economic profits were largely shaved off by foreign, Western European powers. In reaction to the humiliation caused by this blatant foreign incursion into Chinese lands, nationalist sentiment grew within China, often calling for China to self-strengthen from within. This anti-foreigner movement was best exemplified by the Boxer Uprising in 1900. In the uprising, Chinese nationalists spread across northern China, murdering foreigners and missionaries and eventually laying siege to the foreign-controlled cities of Beijing and Tianjin. The rebellion was brutally put down by a group of Western allies, and most of northern China was occupied by Western troops afterwards. A 1911 revolution in China installed a republican form of government. After World War I, internal Chinese politics saw an internal power struggle between the Republican nationalists and the growing, Soviet-supported Chinese Communist Party. After an attempted kidnapping of the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek in 1926, Chiang imposed severe restrictions on communist activities, although a communist underground was slowly growing support in the countryside. A librarian and devoted communist from Beijing, Mao Zedong, was slowly building Soviet-style enclaves in rural China and recruiting a guerrilla force. The country remained largely under nationalist control for the next decade, and Chiang Kai-shek spent numerous resources sending the nationalist army on campaigns in northern China against the communists. Chiang's constant campaigns toward rooting out Chinese communism forced Mao to lead his followers on the infamous Long March in 1934. Where approximately 100,000 Communist Party members fled some 12,500 kilometers, only about 8,000 making it to the final destination in Shaanxi province. While Chiang chased Mao's communists around the interior of the country, to the east loomed the continuous presence of an expansionary and increasingly militaristic Japan. Indeed, Japan was not content merely with its control of the Korean peninsula and influence in Shandong province, so in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and set up a puppet Chinese government under Japanese control. Though the League of Nations and Western Europe condemned Japan's seizure of Manchuria, there was little they could do to aid China. The 1929 Wall Street collapse and the Great Depression left most Western states incapable of paying for military intervention in China. Japanese troops pushed south from Manchuria, taking control of territory along China's east coast. In 1937, under considerable pressure from the Chinese public, Chiang Kai-shek interrupted his campaign against the Communists to meet the invading Japanese forces. The Nationalists and Communists even signed a pact to fight together against the Japanese, but this coalition quickly broke down. Japan continued to gain territory in northern and eastern China, ruthlessly treating the Chinese people they governed. The rape of Nanking, for example, in December 1937, saw Japanese troops rape, loot, murder, and pillage throughout the Chinese capital of Nanking for several weeks. Historians' best rough estimates claim approximately 250,000 Chinese people lost their lives in the incident, though numbers concerning this event in particular are highly contested. The failures of the nationalist government in defending China against Japanese incursions led to the growth of the Chinese Communist Party, who had continued operating in rural China, outside the scope and reach of either the nationalists or the Japanese invaders. During World War II, party membership rose exponentially, rising to 1.2 million members in 1945. The interwar period was a tumultuous time for both Japan and China. As nationalist and militaristic factions slowly gained power in the increasingly modernized Japan, these officials looked to the Asian continent for territorial acquisition and military glory. Simultaneously, China was incredibly vulnerable, as nearly a century of Western intervention had weakened the Chinese government, and the ensuing civil war between China's nationalists and communists only worsened China's predicament. This made the country susceptible to Japanese aggression, which the West could not afford to do much about during the Great Depression. It would take defeat in World War II to both stop Japanese aggression in China and open up possibilities for the growing Chinese Communist Party.